Sweetheart, sit down and cancel your plans, because the roof just caved in on Stefon Diggs, and by the time the last word of this leaves my mouth, every single person in that man's inner circle is going to be permanently unavailable for comment. New paperwork just landed on the docket in the Christopher Blake Griffin matter, and this is not a whisper from a burner account. This is not a TikTok rumor circulating at 3 in the morning. This is not somebody's second cousin's manager pretending to have a source. This is stamped, signed, filed, and sworn under penalty of perjury, which is the polite legal way of saying that if the man who put his name on it is lying, he goes straight to a federal cage without collecting $200. So take a breath, pour something warm, and let me walk you through the most catastrophic 72 hours of Stefon Diggs' entire adult life. Because what Christopher Blake Griffin just delivered to that judge is not a filing. That is a demolition crew arriving on site, and Stefon Diggs is the building marked for the wrecking ball. Before the keyboards start warming up, before the group chats start firing, before somebody's Annie hops in the comments to tell me I do not have a shred of proof, I need you to understand a very specific difference. The difference between what happens on Instagram and what happens inside a courthouse. On Instagram, you can post a caption, delete it, blame your assistant, laugh it off, and keep moving. Inside a courthouse, when you sign a document under penalty of perjury, and it turns out to be even slightly untrue, you have just handed the federal government a house key and permission to walk right in. So the fact that Christopher Blake Griffin has now sworn on the record that he is holding text messages, phone logs, flight itineraries, and coordination records that came directly from the inside of Stefon Diggs' own camp should be raising the hair on your forearms right now. Because Stefon Diggs, the same man who fought discovery like it was a corner route in the red zone, the same man who tried to act like he barely recognized Christopher Blake Griffin's name in interrogatories, the same man whose attorneys have been sweating through their collars for months, has now, by order of the court, been forced to hand over the exact paper trail that is going to bury him. That is not a headline, folks. That is a career obituary being drafted in real time. Let me set the table for anybody just walking in, because I know a good portion of you clicked because the thumbnail had the name Cardi B on it, and darling, I love you for it. We will absolutely get to the WAP superstar in a minute, because her fingerprints are all through this file like breadcrumbs through a forest, but first the foundation. Christopher Blake Griffin is a musician, an entrepreneur, a young black man who, according to his own filed complaint, was orbiting Stefon Diggs' world back in the spring of 2023, when Stefon Diggs was still a Buffalo Bill and still very much in the business of curating the public version of himself. Christopher Blake Griffin alleges that on a particular night at Stefon Diggs' Maryland residence, Stefon Diggs crossed a line no professional relationship should ever brush against. Christopher Blake Griffin claims Stefon Diggs made unwanted advances. Christopher Blake Griffin says Stefon Diggs used physical force. And Christopher Blake Griffin swears that when he rejected those advances, Stefon Diggs retaliated by dispatching a crew, including a family member, to Christopher Blake Griffin's home, where they inflicted a beating so brutal that the surveillance cameras caught every last swing on video. That is the origin story of this case. That is the seed that has now grown into the towering tree that Stefon Diggs is standing beneath with a chainsaw pointed at his own trunk. And here is the part a huge chunk of the internet keeps managing to miss. Stefon Diggs is the one who filed suit first. Let that stew for a second. Stefon Diggs, with his money, with his brand, with his image, with a stable of lawyers on retainer, looked at his team and said, no, we are not letting this stay quiet. We are not negotiating a private resolution. We are not doing what every crisis manager in the country would have advised. Stefon Diggs said, I want to sue this man for defamation. And what that decision means, in practical terms, is that Stefon Diggs volunteered himself into a discovery war. Stefon Diggs personally invited a judge into every crevice of his private life. Stefon Diggs handed Christopher Blake Griffin a legal license to demand every text, every call, every travel record, every hotel invoice, every witness. And now that license has been used, and the results are on the docket. Stefon Diggs, darling, this is what my grandmother would call self-inflicted. This is what we call teaching the fish to grease its own pan. Now, hold on, because I already hear the defense squad revving up the engines. I already see the comments loading. Well, Christopher Blake Griffin is messy. Well, Christopher Blake Griffin has a shady past. Well, Christopher Blake Griffin has a baby mother who posted a whole dissertation on Instagram about the type of company he keeps. And listen, I am not out here nominating Christopher Blake Griffin for sainthood. I have seen the same post you have seen. I know his baby mother came out and did the entire put your finger down trend about child support and about the kind of rooms Christopher Blake Griffin has been known to move through. I saw it. I read it. I understood the message. But if we are being honest, and this channel is nothing if not honest, the exact same argument Stefon Diggs' supporters keep using to discredit Christopher Blake Griffin is the same argument a competent lawyer will use to explain how Christopher Blake Griffin ended up standing in Stefon Diggs' living room in the first place. You cannot in one breath call Christopher Blake Griffin a fixer, a facilitator, a shadow operator who quietly moves through the elite entertainment world, and then in the next breath act stunned that a professional athlete would call him, invite him over, and try to leverage that exact dynamic. Pick a lane, folks. And whichever lane you pick, either Christopher Blake Griffin is the messy insider or Christopher Blake Griffin is the innocent artist. Neither lane comes anywhere close to clearing Stefon Diggs of what is now sitting in that court file. So let us crack that file open. According to reporting that surfaced through TMZ and was then confirmed inside the sworn amended pleading, Christopher Blake Griffin's legal team is now in possession of text messages and phone records obtained directly through court-ordered discovery. Meaning obtained directly from Stefon Diggs' own document production. And those communications, according to the filing, demonstrate the coordination of the assault that Christopher Blake Griffin says he suffered. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. Coordination of the assault. Not a coincidence. Not a random flare-up. Not spontaneous street beef. Coordination. As in planned. As in logistics. As in we need a flight. We need a hotel. We need to be in that city on that day. That is not what innocent people do. That is what people who are about to commit a serious crime do. And those communications, according to Christopher Blake Griffin's own filing, involve Stefon Diggs' personal assistant. The exact same personal assistant whose name has already surfaced inside another Stefon Diggs-adjacent legal matter involving Chef Mila. So the assistant is not a mystery figure. The assistant is not a stranger. The assistant is a witness whose testimony pattern has already been established in court. And now that same assistant's phone is talking too. And that, folks, is the domino that Stefon Diggs' camp underestimated at their own peril. Because when the Chef Mila matter first surfaced and the assistant testified there, half the internet dismissed it as boss and employee friction. But the sharp observers knew right then that the assistant was a walking spreadsheet of everything Stefon Diggs does. Who he calls, who he pays, who he flies, where he stays, who books the cars, who handles the gifts. And when a spreadsheet like that gets subpoenaed, sweetheart, it does not lie for anybody. It does not spin. It does not go on Instagram at midnight to defend anybody. It just sits there in black and white, waiting to be laminated and handed to a jury. Buckle up, because if that alone were the extent of what Christopher Blake Griffin dropped this week, it would already be a 5-alarm fire for Stefon Diggs. But it climbs higher. Christopher Blake Griffin's filing pushes the knife in another inch by claiming that the phone records show Stefon Diggs personally placed a call to one of the men who was allegedly attacking Christopher Blake Griffin at the exact minute the attack was in progress. Read that sentence again slowly. At the exact minute. The surveillance video Christopher Blake Griffin has already released publicly, and I am not going to replay that footage here because it is genuinely gruesome and I refuse to make a spectacle of a black man being stomped on camera. Shows one of the alleged attackers pausing mid-assault, pulling out a ringing phone, and taking the call. And according to the phone log now sitting in Christopher Blake Griffin's possession, that incoming call was placed by Stefon Diggs. That is not circumstantial. That is not a hunch. That is not an inference. That is a phone number attached to a name attached to a timestamp attached to a video attached to a beating. That is what prosecutors politely call a nexus. And a nexus is the exact connective tissue that turns a civil complaint into a criminal referral. And this is the moment I want everybody still holding out for Stefon Diggs' version of events to slow all the way down. Stefon Diggs' entire defense from day one, in every filing, in every public post, in every whispered leak to sympathetic outlets, has hinged on a single claim. He stole from me. That is the drum Stefon Diggs and his team have been pounding for months on end. Christopher Blake Griffin was a thief. Christopher Blake Griffin walked off with property. Christopher Blake Griffin got exactly what was coming to him because Christopher Blake Griffin took what did not belong to him. Fine. Let us pretend, for one generous moment, that every syllable of that theft story is true. Let us pretend Christopher Blake Griffin waltzed out of that Maryland home with a duffel bag full of watches, chains, cash, and designer everything. Even inside that fantasy, what does a normal, law-abiding, wealthy adult with a legal team on retainer do the very next morning? He calls the police. He files a report. He hands the matter to a detective. He lets the state of Maryland do the work the taxpayers already funded. What he does not do, under any circumstance, is coordinate a private beatdown across state lines with a family member and a hired crew. That is not justice. That is a felony. Multiple felonies actually, stacked like room service pancakes on a Sunday morning. And here is the hypocrisy dagger Stefon Diggs cannot pull out of his own chest. Stefon Diggs never at any point filed a theft report. Not in Maryland. Not in New York. Not in California. Not anywhere the sun rises. If Christopher Blake Griffin truly walked off with hundreds of thousands of dollars in property, as Stefon Diggs' team has repeatedly hinted, then where is the incident report? Where is the police case number? Where is the insurance claim? Where is the private investigator's statement? None of it exists. Not a scrap. Because you cannot report a theft that did not happen without committing a crime on the way out of the precinct. And Stefon Diggs' lawyers, who are not rookies, understood that from the very first meeting, which is precisely why the theft story has always lived on Instagram, in tabloid whispers, and inside Stefon Diggs' own legal filings, and never, not one time, inside an actual police station. That is the tell. That is the crack running down the wall. That is the moment a careful listener figures out what is really going on in this case. Let me pause and speak to the folks who came here specifically for the celebrity crossover, because I owe you the bridge to the Cardi B of it all. Cardi B, bless her heart, and I mean that in the Southern way. Cardi B has been remarkably vocal in defending Stefon Diggs online, right up until the moment the new evidence started dropping into the docket, at which point Cardi B suddenly redirected her energy to other feuds, other beefs, other targets. And I want to be careful here, because I do have love for Cardi B. I have love for her hustle. I have love for her willingness to be honest about her own life in ways most celebrities never dare. But there is a version of loyalty that helps a man, and there is a version of loyalty that buries a man, and Cardi B, whether she realizes it yet or not, has been practicing the burying kind. Because every single time Cardi B has jumped online to call Christopher Blake Griffin a liar, every time Cardi B has told TMZ the story is being twisted, every time Cardi B has implied that a defamation lawsuit is somehow proof of innocence in the underlying allegations, she has been doing the exact thing that Christopher Blake Griffin's attorneys are now labeling as further defamation. That is not me being petty. That is what the amended complaint literally says. Christopher Blake Griffin is now asking the judge for permission to add a new defamation count against Stefon Diggs based on a social media post in which Stefon Diggs, without technically naming Christopher Blake Griffin, essentially called him a thief and a liar to an audience of millions. And guess who has been echoing that same messaging from her own account? That is right. The WAP superstar herself. Now some of you are already typing, well, Cardi B has every right to defend her partner. And she does. Nobody is taking that right away from Cardi B. But there is a canyon of difference between saying I love him and I stand by him, and going on record calling another human being a liar when you have not read one page of the discovery file. That is not defense. That is the same broken calculator arithmetic where somebody is convinced that 2 + 2 = 16 because they need the answer to look a certain way. If the apples add up to 5, sweetheart, the problem is not the apples. The problem is the calculator. And Cardi B has been punching in numbers that do not match the tape. Moving on, folks, because the layers on this case are like an onion left out in the summer heat. Christopher Blake Griffin's filing also references a criminal proceeding in the state of California in which a man who happens to share Stefon Diggs' middle name and last name was actually charged and convicted for the very same assault. I am not going to speculate publicly about which family member that is, but the internet has already done its homework, and anybody who has been following this story knows exactly who we are talking about. Stefon Diggs' own model brother. And the fact that a member of Stefon Diggs' immediate family has already been formally processed through the criminal justice system for the same beating Christopher Blake Griffin is describing is not a small detail. That is corroboration. That is the state of California, on its own, without any prompting from Christopher Blake Griffin's civil team, confirming under the burden of criminal proof that a crime occurred. The only unanswered questions in the civil case now are who ordered it, who paid for it, and who benefited from it. And the phone log, that same phone log that keeps circling back into the picture, appears to answer all three of those questions on a single sheet of paper. I want to remind everybody of one detail that feels tiny until you tilt it in the light. On the day of the assault, according to Christopher Blake Griffin, Stefon Diggs had gifted him a diamond watch. Sit with the choreography of that for a second. Sit with the timing. Sit with the theater of a professional athlete handing an expensive distraction to a man whose home was already scheduled for a violent visit later that same day. That is not friendship. That is not generosity. That is what any experienced prosecutor would describe as consciousness of guilt wrapped in a gift box. That is the kind of detail jurors do not forget. That is the kind of visual that gets seared into a courtroom's collective memory. The diamond watch on the wrist of a man about to have his skull kicked in. And when Christopher Blake Griffin's lawyers stand up and tell that story with the phone log projected onto the screen behind them, Stefon Diggs' defense is going to shrink to a whisper by lunchtime on day 2. Speaking of that defense, Stefon Diggs' legal team has been running the same three-part playbook since the day this thing started. Part 1. Christopher Blake Griffin is a thief. Part 2. Christopher Blake Griffin is fabricating everything for attention and money. Part 3. Anything Stefon Diggs did afterward was justified or unrelated. Part 1 collapses under the simple question of why no theft report was ever filed. Part 2 collapses under the fact that Christopher Blake Griffin has been consistent, has surveillance footage, and is now armed with phone logs pulled out of Stefon Diggs' own Discovery production. And Part 3, the idea that Stefon Diggs did nothing wrong once the alleged theft ended, evaporates the exact second the phone records show Stefon Diggs on the line with an attacker during the attack. That is not a defense that survives cross-examination. That is a defense that gets shredded before the jury has finished their morning coffee. And here is where the O.J. Simpson comparison becomes unavoidable, because history keeps teaching us the same lesson and we keep declining to open the textbook. Everybody remembers how the O.J. Simpson murder trial ended. What most people conveniently forget is how O.J.'s freedom actually ended. It ended in a Las Vegas hotel room, when O.J., convinced he had a moral right to reclaim memorabilia he believed belonged to him, organized a crew, walked in armed, and tried to take back property by force. And the state of Nevada, unlike the state of California in the murder trial, was not particularly interested in his celebrity or his backstory. Nevada looked at the coordination, looked at the participants, looked at the weapons, and dropped a sentence on O.J. Simpson that swallowed the better part of a decade of his life. Because in the United States of America, you do not get to appoint yourself judge, jury, and enforcement squad. You do not get to decide that because somebody wronged you, you can gather your associates and go collect. That is not how the law works. That is not how it has ever worked. And Stefon Diggs, if the evidence Christopher Blake Griffin has now filed holds up under scrutiny, is walking down the same exact corridor that O.J. Simpson walked down. Let me hit the pattern, because this matters. This is not the first time Stefon Diggs' name has surfaced in a story where somebody claims to have been mistreated inside his orbit. This is not the first time we have heard the phrase "they were trying to steal from me" deployed as a blanket justification. I am not a private investigator. I do not know how deep the well runs. But when the same excuse gets used across multiple incidents, involving multiple people, spanning multiple states, at some point the pattern becomes the story. At some point, either every person Stefon Diggs encounters is a thief, which, sweetheart, is statistically laughable, or Stefon Diggs has a habit of reaching for the theft excuse whenever a private altercation goes sideways. Occam's razor is not being kind to Stefon Diggs on this one. Let me be very clear about something before we go any further, because I do not want anybody thinking I am running some personal vendetta. I am not. I have watched Stefon Diggs play football since his Minnesota days. I have cheered his catches. I have appreciated the artistry of his footwork on the sideline. I am not a person who has been sitting around for years waiting to take a shot at Stefon Diggs. But my appreciation for a man's on-field brilliance does not obligate me to be silent when serious allegations, corroborated by state criminal convictions, corroborated by surveillance footage, and now corroborated by his own discovery documents, are sitting on a public court file. If Stefon Diggs did what Christopher Blake Griffin says Stefon Diggs did, then Stefon Diggs deserves the full weight of a civil judgment and possibly the personal attention of a criminal prosecutor. And if Stefon Diggs did not do what Christopher Blake Griffin claims, then Stefon Diggs' lawyers now have the very fun task of explaining the phone log, the flight records, the hotel bookings, the diamond watch, the family conviction, and the assistance coordination texts. Good luck, counselor. Good luck. Circling back to the Cardi B of it all, because I know a portion of you came for that entire plate. Cardi B, in the last 72 hours, has done something extremely telling. She has gone quiet on this specific matter. She still has energy for other feuds. She still has fingers to type about other beefs. But when the subject turns to Christopher Blake Griffin, when the subject turns to the amended complaint, when the subject turns to the phone log or the diamond watch, silence. And in the world of celebrity communications, silence is never neutral. Silence is a strategic decision. Silence means the lawyers have entered the room. Silence means a crisis firm has been retained. Silence means somebody sat Cardi B down and said whatever you were about to post, sweetheart, do not post it, because Christopher Blake Griffin's attorneys will print it out and file it as an exhibit. That is exactly what silence sounds like. And that silence, coming from Cardi B of all humans, a woman who built her entire empire on saying whatever crosses her mind the second it crosses her mind, is one of the loudest signals we have received, yet that the people around Stefon Diggs know exactly how bad the evidence looks. Let me address the folks who keep asking why Christopher Blake Griffin does not just settle. Why go through all of this? Why file amended complaints? Why chase discovery? Why publicize the surveillance video? Why endure the online attacks from Stefon Diggs' fanbase, from Cardi B's fanbase, from every last corner of the internet that has already decided the celebrity version of events is the only one worth taking seriously? And the answer, if you actually read the pleadings instead of the tweets, is that Christopher Blake Griffin is asking for a jury trial. Not a bench trial. Not a private mediation. Not a hush deal. A jury. 12 people from the community sitting in the box, watching the surveillance footage, hearing from the assistant, reading the phone log, and deciding in public, on the taxpayer's dime, whether Stefon Diggs did what Christopher Blake Griffin says Stefon Diggs did. That is not a man chasing a payday. That is a man chasing a verdict. And there is a genuine difference between those two things, and anybody who has spent 5 minutes near a civil docket knows it. Here is something the amateur analysts online have completely glossed over. When a plaintiff amends a complaint to add new causes of action deep into the discovery phase, it is almost always because discovery has produced material that supports new claims. That is the diplomatic way of saying Christopher Blake Griffin found gold inside the boxes Stefon Diggs was forced to hand over. Because a lawyer does not go back to a judge asking permission to add a defamation count unless they have the receipts to make that count stick. A lawyer does not risk the existing case by stacking new claims on top unless the new claims are demonstrably stronger than what the case was built on originally. So when Christopher Blake Griffin's team files an amended complaint asking to add defamation and asking to base it on Stefon Diggs' own public post, that is lawyerly for we caught you and we can prove it, and now we are going to make you pay for it twice. Let me spend a beat on that public post because the amended complaint pivots on it. In that post, Stefon Diggs, without technically naming Christopher Blake Griffin, but with context clues a toddler could connect, called Christopher Blake Griffin a liar, called Christopher Blake Griffin a thief, and painted himself as the victim of a shakedown. And the millisecond Stefon Diggs pressed post on that message, Stefon Diggs handed Christopher Blake Griffin's lawyers a brand new cause of action on a silver platter. Because defamation, at its cleanest definition, is the publication of a false statement of fact that damages another person's reputation. And if the underlying facts of this case break against Stefon Diggs, then every accusation inside that social media post becomes a live broadcast to millions of eyeballs. That is not a good address for Stefon Diggs to reside at. That is a neighborhood where the damages number climbs every time somebody hits screenshot. Let me zoom out for a moment and talk about why this case matters far beyond the specific parties involved. Because Christopher Blake Griffin's allegations, if they hold up, describe a very particular kind of celebrity abuse. The kind where a wealthy, powerful, protected figure uses money, connections, and physical intimidation to silence a person who could damage their public image. We have seen versions of this playbook before. We saw it with a certain music mogul. We saw it with certain athletes. We saw it with certain producers whose names now sit inside federal indictments. And every time this playbook has been peeled open, the public arc has been depressingly consistent. Disbelief, followed by defense, followed by dismissal, followed by silence, followed by an eventual acknowledgement that the accuser had been telling the truth from the very first sentence. That is the arc. That is the recurring pattern. And Christopher Blake Griffin's case is sitting somewhere between the disbelief and the defense phase right now. But the phone log, folks, the phone log has just pushed us squarely into the beginning of the dismissal becomes impossible phase. That is precisely why the coming weeks are going to be seismic. Once the amended complaint is officially docketed, once the discovery documents start being cited by name inside filings, once the assistant is potentially deposed under oath in this specific matter rather than in the Chef Mila proceeding, we are going to receive a very clean picture of what Stefon Diggs actually did or did not do on that Maryland night and in the days that followed. And if that picture confirms Christopher Blake Griffin's account, Stefon Diggs' endorsements, his roster spot, his post-career broadcasting hopes, and every last inch of his public image are going to collide with a wall no crisis PR firm on this continent has the bricks to rebuild. Because sponsors, unlike fans, do not vibe with ambiguity. Sponsors read the court file. Sponsors calculate risk. Sponsors have exit clauses. And exit clauses get pulled the very afternoon a phone log shows a client on the line with an attacker during an assault. Let me address one more thread from the comments, because I have seen it and it deserves an honest answer. Some folks are saying, well, Christopher Blake Griffin never personally walked into a police station. So how serious could the allegations really be? I understand the instinct behind that question. I truly do. But I want you to understand something about the on-the-ground reality of sexual assault reporting in this country, particularly when the accused is wealthy, connected, and publicly beloved. The rate at which survivors report to law enforcement is heartbreakingly low. The rate at which those reports actually result in prosecution is even lower. And when the accused is a black man in the NFL with legions of fans and a chart-topping celebrity partner, the personal cost of walking into a precinct can be catastrophic before a single detective even opens a case folder. So the fact that Christopher Blake Griffin chose the civil route first, the route that gives him control over discovery, the route that lets him build a paper trail, the route that produces the kind of evidence that includes phone logs, is not weakness. That is strategy. And that strategy just paid off in a very public way this week. I also want to address the framing that Christopher Blake Griffin is somehow benefiting financially from this case. Because yes, civil suits do involve damages. Yes, monetary relief is being sought. But if you actually read the pleadings instead of the tabloid summaries, the damages Christopher Blake Griffin is asking for are calibrated to the physical injuries he sustained, the psychological trauma he alleges, and the professional harm inflicted by Stefon Diggs' public statements. That is precisely what civil damages exist to remedy. That is literally the point of the civil justice system. To argue that Christopher Blake Griffin should not seek damages because damages exist is to argue that the entire civil docket in America is illegitimate. And nobody making that argument in good faith actually believes it. It is a deflection. And it is a deflection specifically designed to make Christopher Blake Griffin's motives look impure so that the underlying facts get quietly ignored. Please do not fall for it. So where does this leave us in the summer of a case that has already produced more twists than a soap opera writing room? It leaves us with Stefon Diggs standing at a legal cliff, holding a defense strategy that just got liquefied by his own discovery documents. It leaves us with a celebrity partner whose loyalty is being strategically muzzled by her legal team. It leaves us with a family member already criminally convicted in a directly related matter. It leaves us with a personal assistant whose testimony pattern is already carved in stone. It leaves us with a public finally starting to notice the shape of the pattern. And it leaves us with a plaintiff, Christopher Blake Griffin, who is not asking for a settlement, not asking for a hush deal, not asking for a wire transfer. Christopher Blake Griffin is asking for a jury of 12 strangers to sit in a public room and render a verdict. That is not a case that vanishes. That is a case that becomes a spectacle. And spectacles, in the modern media era, are career-ending events for any figure whose brand depends on public affection. I want to leave you with a thought that has been sitting with me since I first started reading through the amended complaint. Stefon Diggs on the field is one of the most gifted receivers of his generation. Off the field, Stefon Diggs is now a man accused of using violence and money to solve a problem that a single phone call to a good lawyer or a single phone call to a police precinct could have handled without a bruise being raised. That gap, that canyon, between the Stefon Diggs the public sees on Sundays and the Stefon Diggs described inside Christopher Blake Griffin's amended complaint, is the quiet tragedy at the center of this entire story. Because if the allegations are proven, then Stefon Diggs is a man who had everything, who conquered every level of his sport, who was engaged in a very public romance with one of the biggest musicians on earth, who had a brand and a legacy, and who, according to the evidence now piling up on the docket, threw all of it into a fire because he could not accept a single word. No. And that is what the jury, if this case reaches a jury, is going to be asked to decide. Not whether Stefon Diggs was a great football player. Not whether Christopher Blake Griffin is a perfect human being. Not whether Cardi B chose wisely. Not whether the assistant is a saint or a schemer. The only question a jury will be handed is whether the phone logs, the text threads, the surveillance footage, the flight records, the hotel bookings, the diamond watch, the criminal conviction of the family member, and the amended complaint filed under penalty of perjury add up to a preponderance of the evidence that Stefon Diggs did what Christopher Blake Griffin says Stefon Diggs did. And based on what has already been filed, based on what has already been reported, based on what has already been independently corroborated, my honest personal read, and this is only my read, is that Stefon Diggs' lawyers are already having very tense conversations behind very closed doors about whether a jury trial is a fight Stefon Diggs can actually afford to have. So let me leave you with this. If Christopher Blake Griffin is telling the truth, we are watching the opening credits of the end of a superstar's public life. If Stefon Diggs is telling the truth, then Stefon Diggs is about to have the most explosive vindication moment in modern sports media history. Because with this level of evidence in play, there is no middle ground remaining. There is no quiet settlement remaining. There is no polite dismissal remaining. Somebody is walking out of that courtroom with their reputation restored, and somebody is walking out of that courtroom in permanent ruins. And based on what Christopher Blake Griffin has already filed, based on what Stefon Diggs' own discovery has already coughed up, based on the phone log that keeps returning to the exact same conclusion, I know which side I am putting my money on. And it is not the side that handed somebody a diamond watch on the morning of a beating. Drop your take in the comments and tell me. Do you think Stefon Diggs is going to try to settle this quietly now that the evidence has surfaced? Or do you think Cardi B is going to keep him locked inside a public fight his lawyers are begging him to abandon? Tell me who you think the real strategist is in that household. Tell me if you think the WAP superstar silence is going to hold, or if she is about to post something that becomes Exhibit B in the next amended complaint. Tell me honestly whether you believe a case this loud ends in a courtroom, or whether it ends inside a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to double as a doorstop. I am reading every comment. I am pinning the sharpest takes. And I am coming right back the second the next filing hits the docket, because with evidence this loud already in motion, the next filing is not a question of if. It is a question of when. Take care of yourselves out there. Protect your peace. Believe survivors when they come bearing receipts. And remember, inside a court of law, the only currency that spins is evidence. And Christopher Blake Griffin, whether you love him or you cannot stand him, has just deposited a full bank vault into the record. I will see you in the next one, because before the ink even dries on this filing, another one is already being drafted in an office somewhere in this country. And when it lands, sweetheart, I will be right here to walk through it with you, receipt by receipt, phone log by phone log, and page by page, until every single question in this case gets an answer.